Some journeys end where they began, and some ghosts refuse to stay buried. For aging cowboy Tom Ransom, a lifetime of running was about to catch up with him in the most unexpected way, deep in the Northern California wilderness, with winter closing in and nowhere left to go. Tom and his horse Clover discover something impossible, a giant redwood tree with a wooden door carved into its trunk. Inside the warm hollow, he finds relics from his past, old photographs, his mother's letters, a saddle he thought lost forever. But someone put them there, someone who knew his secrets, someone waiting 40 years. What would you do if the past you fled came back with answers you never expected? Before we continue, tell us where you're from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cold came early that year, settling into the bones of the land like an old ache that wouldn't ease. Tom Ransom felt it in his joints first, the way he always did when winter pushed down from the north. He was 68 years old, though he'd stopped counting somewhere around 55. Numbers didn't matter much when you measured your life in miles traveled rather than years lived. He sat astride Clover, his roan mare, as they picked their way through a dense grove of Douglas fir. The trees stood like silent witnesses to their passage, their branches heavy with the promise of snow. Clover was 16 now, old for a horse that had spent her life on rough trails and hard ground. Her gait had slowed over the past year, matching Tom's own diminished pace. They were two old souls making their way through the world together, understanding each other in the wordless way that comes from shared hardship and mutual dependence. Tom had acquired Clover in Nevada, 12 years back, from a rancher who couldn't afford to feed her through a drought. She'd been 4 then, already trained but stubborn, with a white blaze down her face that reminded Tom of lightning splitting a dark sky. He'd paid $60 for her, which was most of what he had at the time. It was one of the few decisions in his long life he'd never questioned. "Easy now," Tom murmured, feeling Clover's hesitation as they navigated a steep descent. His voice was low and gravelly, worn smooth by decades of sparse use. He wasn't a man given to talking, even to his horse, but he believed in the comfort of a human voice. Clover's ears flicked back, acknowledging him, and she continued with careful steps. They were deep in Northern California now, somewhere in the coastal mountains where the redwoods grew to impossible heights. Tom had been through this territory once before, maybe 30 years ago, working a lumber camp for a season. He remembered the fog that rolled in like a living thing and the way sound got swallowed up by the massive trees. It was country that made a man feel small, but not in a bad way. More like it put things in proper perspective. The day was fading, that peculiar twilight that comes early in dense forest. Tom estimated they had maybe an hour of useful light left, and he needed to find shelter. The temperature was dropping fast, and his breath was starting to fog. His coat, a sheepskin-lined canvas jacket he'd owned for 20 years, was warm enough. But sleeping rough in this cold would be hard on both of them. He'd left the last logging road 3 days ago, following an old trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. He wasn't running from anything specific this time. No creditors or angry foremen, or towns that had worn out their welcome. He was just moving, the way he'd been moving for 40 years. It was what he knew. It was who he was, or who he'd become anyway. Tom had grown up in eastern Oregon, in a small ranching community where everyone knew everyone else's business. His father had run cattle. Not many, but enough to keep the family fed. Tom had been the eldest of 3 children, expected to take over the operation eventually. He'd been good with horses, had a steady hand and a patient temperament. People said he'd make a fine rancher. That was before everything fell apart. He pushed the memory away, the way he'd been doing for 4 decades. Some things didn't bear thinking about. Some things you just carried silent and heavy until they became part of your very bones. Clover snorted and stopped abruptly. Tom straightened in the saddle, instantly alert. The mare's ears were forward, her body tense. She'd sensed something. "What is it, girl?" Tom scanned the darkening forest. The trees here were massive, old-growth redwoods that had stood for centuries. Their trunks were wider than a man could reach around, their bark thick and furrowed like ancient skin. The undergrowth was sparse in their shadow, mostly ferns and fallen needles that carpeted the forest floor. Then he saw it. At first, Tom thought his eyes were playing tricks on him in the fading light. But as Clover took a tentative step forward, there was no mistaking what stood before them. A redwood tree, massive even by the standards of this forest, with something that shouldn't exist carved into its trunk, a door. An actual wooden door, fitted neatly into the base of the tree, as if the redwood had grown around it. Tom dismounted slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He kept Clover's reins in one hand and approached the tree on foot. The door was real, solid wood, weathered but well-maintained. It had a simple iron handle and what looked like hand-forged hinges. There was no lock, no sign indicating what lay beyond. He stood there for a long moment studying it. The door was maybe 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, proportioned for a person of average size. The craftsmanship was excellent, the kind of careful work that spoke of someone who knew wood and respected it. The edges fit perfectly against the living tree, as if whoever had made this had taken great care not to harm the redwood. Tom ran his fingers along the doorframe. The tree bark was healthy, grown thick around the edges of the opening. This door had been here for years, maybe decades, but why? And who would carve a door into a living redwood in the middle of nowhere? The wind picked up, stirring the high branches above with a sound like distant water. The temperature was dropping faster now. Tom could see his breath clearly. Snow would come tonight, he was certain of it. They needed shelter. He knocked on the door. 3 solid raps that echoed strangely in the hollow space beyond. Tom waited, counting to 30 in his head. No response came. He knocked again, louder this time, and announced himself. "Hello? Anyone home?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too loud in the quiet forest. Clover shifted behind him, uneasy. Tom waited another minute, then tried the handle. It turned smoothly, well-oiled hinges swinging without a sound. Warm air rushed out to meet him, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Coffee maybe, or herbs. Tom blinked in surprise. The interior was lit, a soft golden glow that spoke of lanterns or firelight. He could see steps leading down into the hollow tree, carved right into the living wood. "Hello," he called again, more tentatively this time. "I don't mean any harm. Just looking for shelter from the storm." Still no answer. Tom stood at the threshold, decades of caution warring with practical necessity. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were sending mixed signals. Something felt off about this place, but not dangerous. More like expectant. Like the tree itself was waiting for something. The first snowflakes began to fall, fat and lazy, drifting down through the canopy above. Tom made his decision. He led Clover around the massive trunk, looking for a place to secure her. On the far side of the tree, he found a natural overhang created by exposed roots and a fallen log. It would provide some protection from the weather. He tied Clover's reins to a sturdy root, removed her saddle, and draped a blanket over her back. "I'll be back soon," he told her, rubbing her neck. "Going to see what's what." Clover nuzzled his shoulder, her way of saying she understood. Tom grabbed his saddlebag, which held most of his earthly possessions, a change of clothes, some jerky, a tin cup, a few other odds and ends. He walked back around to the door, hesitated one more time, then stepped through. The stairs were steep but well made, carved in a spiral that followed the interior curve of the massive trunk. Tom counted 15 steps before reaching the bottom. The hollow was larger than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared up into darkness. But the lower portion had been made into a dwelling of sorts. A small fire burned in a clay-lined pit at the center, its smoke rising up through some unseen vent. Lanterns hung from wooden pegs, driven into the tree's interior walls, casting a warm, steady light. There was a simple cot against one curved wall, covered with wool blankets, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. Shelves holding supplies, canned goods, dried herbs, what looked like medical supplies. A trunk in the corner. Everything was tidy, well-ordered, waiting. But it was the far wall that drew Tom's attention and froze him in place. Photographs, dozens of them, arranged carefully on a broad shelf. And in the center, impossible as it seemed, was a saddle. Not just any saddle, but one Tom recognized immediately. He'd made it himself when he was 23, tooling his initials into the leather on the underside of the seat. TR. He'd been proud of that saddle, had thought it would last him a lifetime. He'd lost it 40 years ago, the night he'd fled home. Lost it along with everything else he'd owned, everything he'd been. Tom's hand went to the wall to steady himself. His heart was hammering in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible. That saddle should be long gone, rotted away or sold off or burned. There was no reason for it to be here, in a hollow tree in the middle of the California wilderness. He moved closer on unsteady legs. The photographs came into focus. There he was, young Tom, maybe 19 or 20, standing beside a pretty dark-haired girl. Both of them were smiling, looking at each other instead of the camera. Another photo, Tom with his family, his mother and father and younger siblings. Tom working on a fence, Tom on horseback. Tom and the dark-haired girl again, her head resting on his shoulder. Sarah. Her name hit him like a physical blow. Sarah Carmichael. He hadn't allowed himself to think that name in 4 decades. Hadn't allowed himself to remember her face or her laugh or the way she'd made him feel like he could do anything, be anyone. But here she was, preserved in faded photographs, forever young while he'd grown old. The memories came flooding back despite all his defenses, sharp and painful as broken glass. The accident, the blood, Sarah's body lying so still on the ground, his certainty that he'd killed her, the panic and guilt that had sent him running into the night, never to return. Tom sank into one of the chairs, his legs no longer reliable. His hands were shaking. He stared at the photographs, at the saddle, at the impossible reality of this place. Someone had collected these things. Someone had known about his past, had gathered up the pieces of the life he'd abandoned, and brought them here. But who? And why? And most impossible of all, how? The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind picked up, and Tom heard the first real fury of the snowstorm beginning. He was trapped here now, for better or worse. Trapped in a hollow tree with ghosts he'd spent a lifetime running from. He sat in the warm light, surrounded by his past, and waited for answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Tom didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the photographs. Time seemed to have lost its meaning in this strange place. The fire burned steady, never seeming to diminish, and the lanterns cast their unwavering glow. Outside, he could hear the storm building, wind whistling through the high branches, and snow beginning to pile against the door above. Finally, he stood and began to explore more carefully. The trunk in the corner drew his attention. It was made of cedar, well crafted, with brass fittings that had been kept polished. Tom knelt beside it and lifted the lid. More pieces of his past lay arranged inside. A pair of work gloves he'd worn through at the ranch. A pocket knife with a bone handle that had been his grandfather's. A leather-bound journal he'd kept for one summer, filled with observations about the weather and the cattle. Things he'd left behind when he fled. Things that should have been lost or discarded decades ago. Beneath these items, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that made his breath catch. He lifted it carefully, unwrapping the cloth with trembling fingers. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, but the handwriting on the top envelope was unmistakable. His mother's careful script, addressing the letter to him, to Thomas, wherever you may be. Tom's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing back tears that felt 40 years overdue. His mother's handwriting. He'd thought he'd never see it again. He'd spent 4 decades believing she'd wanted nothing to do with him after what he'd done. Believing the entire family had written him off as a murderer and a coward. With shaking hands, he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It was dated 6 months after he'd left. "My dearest Tom," it began. "If you're reading this, then by some miracle you've come home, or word has reached you. I don't know where you are. I don't know if you're safe or warm, or if you have enough to eat. But I know you must be hurting, carrying a burden that isn't yours to carry. Tom had to stop reading. His chest was tight, making it hard to breathe. He forced himself to continue. The accident wasn't your fault. I need you to know that. The sheriff investigated. The axle on the wagon was cracked clean through. It had been damaged for weeks, apparently, and no one noticed. It would have broken eventually, no matter who was driving. Sarah knows this. Everyone knows this. There's no blame on you, son. There never was. Sarah survived. She was hurt badly, but she's healing. She asks about you every day. We all do. Please come home. Please let us help you carry whatever guilt you're feeling. You don't have to run, Tom. You don't have to be alone. Your loving mother, Eleanor Ransom. Tom read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper. The axle had been cracked. Not his fault. Sarah had survived. They'd wanted him to come home. All these years, all this running, all the loneliness and isolation and self-imposed exile, it had been for nothing. Based on a misunderstanding. Based on his own panicked assumption and his refusal to face what he'd done. Except he hadn't done anything. The accident wasn't his fault. He opened the second letter, dated a year later. His mother's words were more desperate now, pleading for any word from him. The third letter, 2 years after that, spoke of his father's declining health and his sister Martha's wedding. The fourth, 5 years gone, mentioned his father's death and his mother's move to live with Martha. Each letter ended the same way. Please, come home. We love you. We forgive you. There's nothing to forgive. The last letter was dated 16 years after he'd left. His mother's handwriting was shakier now, the words harder to read. Tom, my boy, I'm dying. The doctor says I have perhaps a few months. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you'd walk through the door. I'm leaving this life with one great regret, that I never got to hold you one more time, to tell you face to face that you were always loved, always wanted, always forgiven. I hope life has been kind to you. I hope you found some peace somewhere. And I hope that someday, in whatever comes after this life, I'll see you again, your mother who loves you still. The letter fell from Tom's hands. He sat on the floor of the hollow tree, his back against the curved wall, and wept. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, a place he'd kept locked and buried for 40 years. He cried for his mother, who'd died hoping to see him again. For his father, who'd never known what became of his eldest son. For Sarah, who'd survived and asked about him. For all the years he'd wasted running from a crime he'd never committed. The storm howled outside, but Tom barely heard it. He was lost in his grief, in the overwhelming weight of wasted time and misplaced guilt. All of it, every lonely night, every town he'd passed through without stopping, every connection he'd refused to make, all of it had been based on a lie he'd told himself. When the tears finally subsided, Tom felt emptied out, hollow as the tree around him. He wiped his face with his sleeve and gathered up the letters carefully, retying them with the blue ribbon. His hands were steadier now, though his chest still ached. He stood slowly, his knees protesting. The photographs on the wall seemed to look at him with new meaning. Not accusations, but invitations. Memories he'd tried to bury, now offered back to him. He studied each one, allowing himself to remember. The harmonica caught his eye next. It sat on a small shelf near the photographs, polished and cared for. Tom picked it up, recognizing it immediately. He'd carved it himself from maple wood, spent weeks getting the reeds just right. He'd made it as a gift for Sarah, planning to give it to her at the harvest dance. The accident had happened 2 days before the dance. He'd never given it to her, had left it behind with everything else. Someone had kept it. Someone had preserved all these things, gathered them, brought them here. But who? And more pressingly, where were they? As if in answer to his thought, Tom heard movement from above. Not from outside, but from higher up in the hollow tree, where the darkness rose into the upper reaches of the trunk. He tensed, instinctively moving toward the stairs. But before he could take more than 2 steps, a voice stopped him. "Hello, Tom." The voice came from the shadows above, soft and aged but unmistakable. A woman's voice. A voice Tom hadn't heard in 40 years, but would have recognized anywhere. Sarah? It couldn't be. His mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring ghosts from the photographs and letters. Sarah was dead. He'd killed her. No, not killed her, but she'd been badly injured, and 40 years was a lifetime. Even if she'd survived, she would have moved on, married, lived her life. She wouldn't be here, in a hollow tree in the wilderness waiting for him. But the voice came again, clearer now. "Yes, Tom, it's me." A figure emerged from the upper darkness, descending stairs that Tom hadn't noticed in the shadows. The lantern light caught her gradually, revealing her in pieces. Grey hair, long and braided. A lined face that still carried echoes of the beauty he remembered. Eyes that watched him with a mixture of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. She was old as he was, wearing a simple wool dress and a shawl over her shoulders. She moved carefully, one hand on the wall for balance, but with a steady confidence that spoke of long familiarity with this place. Sarah Carmichael, alive. Here, Tom's legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the chair. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The past and present had collided, and nothing made sense anymore. Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, studying him with those same eyes he'd remembered in dreams. She didn't move closer, perhaps sensing he needed space to absorb this impossible reality. "You're alive," Tom managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm alive," Sarah confirmed. "I've been waiting for you, Tom. I've been waiting a very long time." They stared at each other across the small space, two old people carrying 4 decades of silence between them. Tom's mind raced through explanations, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Sarah was alive. She was standing right in front of him, aged but unmistakably herself. "I don't understand," Tom finally said. "The accident. You thought I died," Sarah finished quietly. "I know. You left before anyone could tell you otherwise." She moved to the other chair and sat down with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones protested sudden movements. Up close, Tom could see the lines around her eyes, the way age had softened her features. But he could also see the girl she'd been, the one he'd loved with all the fierce certainty of youth. "I was hurt badly," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Broken ribs, a fractured leg, head wound that left me unconscious for 2 days. Everyone thought I might not make it at first. But I'm stubborn." A small smile crossed her face. "You knew that about me." Tom did know that. Sarah had always been determined, the kind of person who set her mind to something and saw it through. It was one of the things he'd loved about her. "When I woke up, you were gone," she said. "Your mother came to see me, told me you'd disappeared the night of the accident. Took your horse and rode off. No one knew where. I couldn't face it," Tom said, his voice rough. "Couldn't face what I'd done to you. I thought—" He stopped, unable to continue. "You thought you'd killed me," Sarah said gently. "Or ruined my life at the very least. So you ran." Tom nodded, shame burning in his chest even now. "I was a coward. You were young and scared and hurt," Sarah corrected. "Well, we all were. But Tom, the accident wasn't your fault. The wagon axle was cracked. The sheriff proved it. Everyone knew it wasn't your fault." "I know that now," Tom said, gesturing toward the letters on the table. "I just read my mother's letters. But I didn't know it then. And by the time I might have learned the truth, I was already—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Already gone," Sarah finished. "Already running." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the forest, but inside the hollow tree it was warm and still. Tom felt like he was in a dream, one of those strange visions where past and present blur together. "How did you find me?" Tom asked. "How did you know I'd come here?" Sarah's expression shifted, becoming something more complex. "I didn't find you exactly. I've been here for 20 years, Tom. This is my home. I built this place, collected your things, and waited. 20 years. Tom's mind struggled to comprehend. "You've been living in a hollow tree for 20 years. "It's not as strange as it sounds," Sarah said with another small smile. "After the accident, after you left, I spent years looking for you. I hired investigators, followed leads, traveled to every town where someone thought they might have seen you. But you were always one step ahead, or the trail was too old, or—" She shrugged. "I never caught up." Tom felt a fresh wave of grief at her words. She'd searched for him. While he'd been running, she'd been trying to find him. Eventually, I gave up the active search, Sarah continued. Came out here to the wilderness, away from everything. I needed peace, needed to stop chasing a ghost. I found this tree, this perfect hollow, and something about it felt right. So I made it home. But the door, Tom said. The things inside, I carved the door myself, Sarah said with a hint of pride. Took me 2 years to do it properly, to make sure I didn't harm the tree. As for your things, she gestured around the hollow, I collected them over time. Bought some from estate sales when your parents passed. Tracked down others through old friends and family. Your sister Martha helped, though she doesn't know about this place. Martha, Tom said, the name catching in his throat. She's still alive, yes. Living in Oregon with her family. She never stopped hoping you'd come back. Sarah's eyes held his. None of us did. Tom had to look away. The weight of their love, their hope, their refusal to forget him. It was almost unbearable. He'd spent so long believing he was alone in the world, unwanted and unforgiven. To learn otherwise now, at 68 years old, felt both like a gift and a cruel joke. Why did you collect these things? Tom asked. Why go to all that trouble? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. Because I knew you were carrying guilt that didn't belong to you. I knew that if you ever stopped running long enough to learn the truth, you'd need proof. Evidence that you were wrong, that you'd been loved all along. She paused. And I suppose I hoped that somehow, some way, you'd find your way here. That the universe would guide you home. I wasn't looking for home, Tom said. I was just running out of places to run, Sarah suggested. Running out of time, perhaps? Tom met her eyes again, and in them he saw understanding. She knew. She knew that he'd come to the end of his road, that this winter felt different from all the others, that he'd been preparing himself in some deep, unconscious way for an ending. How did you know I'd come this direction? He asked. I didn't for certain, Sarah admitted. But I've had people watching for you over the years. Not investigators anymore, just people. Friends, rangers, folks who live out in the wild places. I gave them your description, asked them to spread word if they saw an old cowboy traveling alone. And about a month ago, a ranger mentioned seeing someone matching your description 2 valleys over. So I waited. Tom absorbed this slowly. She'd been waiting for him, specifically for him. This wasn't chance or fate or coincidence. Sarah had orchestrated this reunion, had spent years preparing for it. I found the photograph first, Sarah said, picking up a frame from the shelf. It showed the two of them, young and hopeful, arms around each other. At an estate sale in Idaho, of all places. Someone had bought a box of old photos. Didn't know what they were. When I saw this one, saw us, her voice caught. I knew I had to keep looking. Had to keep gathering pieces of you, in case you ever needed them. Tom reached out and took the photograph from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the realness of her presence. This was no ghost. This was Sarah, alive and breathing and looking at him with eyes that remembered everything they'd been to each other. I'm sorry, Tom said. The words inadequate, but necessary. Sarah, I'm so sorry. For running, for staying away, for wasting all these years. Don't, Sarah interrupted gently. Don't apologize for surviving the only way you knew how. You were in pain, Tom. You made the choice you thought you had to make. It was the wrong choice, Tom said firmly. I should have stayed. Should have faced it. Should have... He stopped, overwhelmed by all the things he should have done. Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her skin was weathered like his, marked by time and hardship, but her grip was warm and steady. You're here now, she said simply. That's what matters. Morning came slowly to the forest, grey light filtering down through layers of snow-heavy branches. Tom woke on the cot, confused for a moment about where he was. Then memory returned, the hollow tree, the photographs, Sarah. He sat up carefully, his back protesting the unfamiliar mattress. Sarah was already awake, tending to the fire and setting a pot of coffee to brew. She moved around the small space with practiced efficiency, clearly at home, in this unusual dwelling. She changed into worn canvas pants and a thick sweater, her grey braid hanging down her back. Morning, she said, noticing he was awake. Storm dumped about 2 feet overnight. We're snowed in for a while. Tom stood and made his way to the stairs, climbing up to check the door. Sarah was right. Snow had drifted against the entrance, sealing them inside. He could push through it if necessary, but there was nowhere to go. The forest would be impassable for days, Clover, he said, sudden worry gripping him. My horse already checked on her, Sarah said from below. There's another entrance higher up the tree, leads to a platform. I keep supplies up there. Your mare is fine, tucked into the shelter you made. I gave her some oats and hay. Tom descended the stairs, relief washing through him. Thank you. Figured you'd be worried, Sarah said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Always did care more about your animals than yourself. They sat at the small table, steam rising from their cups. The coffee was good, strong and hot, exactly what Tom needed. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie quiet that only comes after a heavy snow. Tell me about Clover, Sarah said. How long have you had her? Tom told her the story, finding it easier to talk about his horse than about himself. Sarah listened attentively, asking questions, and slowly the awkwardness of the previous night began to ease. They were still 2 strangers in many ways, separated by decades of different experiences. But the foundation of who they'd been to each other remained, a solid bedrock beneath all the changes. As the morning progressed, they fell into a tentative rhythm. Sarah showed Tom the layout of her home, the storage areas carved into the tree's interior, the clever ventilation system that drew smoke up and out, the platform above where she kept Clover's provisions. The hollow tree was bigger than Tom had realized, extending up perhaps 30 feet, with multiple levels connected by carved stairs and ladders. It's remarkable, Tom said, genuinely impressed. You built all this yourself? Had help with some of it, Sarah admitted. There's a ranger station about 15 miles east. I've gotten to know the rangers over the years. They bring supplies sometimes, help with repairs, but mostly, yes. I did it myself. Tom studied her as she spoke. Sarah had always been capable, but this level of self-sufficiency spoke to something deeper. She'd built a life here, alone in the wilderness, and made it work. There was strength in that, a kind of peace he'd never managed to find. What about you? Sarah asked later, as they prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. Where have you been all these years? What kind of life did you make? Tom hesitated, then decided honesty was the only option. Not much of a life, truth be told. I've worked ranches, lumber camps, mines. Stayed nowhere longer than a season or 2. No real friends, no home. Just me and the road. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That sounds lonely. It was, Tom admitted. But I thought it was what I deserved. After they ate, Sarah showed Tom something else. She went to a shelf and pulled down a leather-bound book, placing it on the table between them. I kept a journal, she said. After the accident, after you left, I wrote in it for years. You should read it if you want. It might help you understand. She paused, searching for words. Help you understand what really happened. Tom opened the journal carefully. The first entry was dated a week after the accident, written in Sarah's careful script. She described waking up in pain, learning that Tom had vanished, the confusion and hurt of his absence. She wrote about the sheriff's investigation, the discovery of the cracked axle, the community's sympathy and support. Everyone had understood it was an accident, a terrible piece of bad luck. But Sarah's entries also revealed something else, her own grief and confusion. She'd loved Tom, had planned a future with him, and suddenly he was gone without explanation. She'd blamed herself at first, wondering if he'd left because he didn't really love her, if the accident had been an excuse to escape. Tom felt fresh shame reading her words. He'd been so caught up in his own guilt that he'd never considered what his disappearance had done to her, to his family. He'd thought he was sparing them his presence, but instead he'd left them with questions and pain. I searched for 3 years solid, Sarah said, watching him read. Every lead, every rumor of a young cowboy passing through somewhere. I found people who'd seen you, places where you'd worked briefly. But you were always gone by the time I arrived. I never stayed anywhere, Tom said. Didn't want to get attached. I know. I figured that out eventually. Sarah paused. There's something else you should know. Tom, something I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. Tom looked up from the journal. something in her tone making him uneasy. When I finally stopped searching, when I came out here, it wasn't just about finding peace. Sarah took a breath. I found out I couldn't have children. Medical complication from the accident, the doctor said. It was part of why I stopped looking for you, to be honest. I thought, she smiled sadly, I thought if I did find you, I'd have to tell you that I couldn't give you the family you'd probably want. Seemed kinder to let you go, let you find someone else. Tom felt his throat tighten. Sarah, I know it's ancient history now, she continued. We're both too old for children anyway. But I wanted you to understand. When I built this place, when I collected your things, it wasn't because I was holding on to a fantasy of what we could have been. It was about setting you free, setting us both free. Tom reached across the table and took her hand again. I never wanted anyone else, he said quietly. Never even tried. Part of me always belonged to you, even when I thought you were dead. Sarah's eyes glistened. We wasted so much time, didn't we? We did, Tom agreed. But maybe, he struggled to find the words, maybe some things are worth waiting for, even if we have to wait a lifetime. They sat together in the warm hollow as snow fell outside. Two old souls finally having the conversation they should have had 40 years ago. And in that moment, despite everything they'd lost, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in decades, the possibility of home. The third day dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter morning that makes everything look newly made. The snow had stopped falling, but the world outside remained locked in white silence. Tom checked on Clover again, finding her content in her shelter with the provisions Sarah had stockpiled. The mare seemed to accept their strange situation, with the calm wisdom of old horses. Back inside the hollow, Tom found Sarah sorting through papers at the table. Maps, he realized as he drew closer. Detailed maps marked with notes and dates. What are those? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. Sarah looked up, a slight hesitation in her expression. Something I probably should have shown you sooner. She spread the largest map out between them. It showed the western United States, marked with dozens of small notations in various colors of ink. I tracked you, she said simply. For about 12 years I tracked your movements. Tom stared at the map. There were marks in Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, California. Each notation had a date beside it. He traced the path with his finger, recognizing the pattern of his wandering. There he was in Battle Mountain in the spring of 1993, Eureka the following winter. Up through the Bitterroot Range, down along the coast, always moving. How did you... I told you I had people watching. Not following you exactly, but keeping an eye out. Rangers, old cowboys, small-town sheriffs, people who noticed strangers passing through. Sarah's finger traced a line of notations. I came close to catching up with you 3 times. Once in Idaho, I missed you by 2 days. Once in Northern California by less than a week. And once in Montana, she paused. I actually saw you. Tom looked up sharply. You saw me? In a town called Wolf Creek. You were shoeing horses for a rancher. I watched you work for about an hour from across the street. Her voice grew soft. You looked different. Older, harder. But I knew it was you. I started to cross the street to call out to you. What stopped you? Sarah met his eyes. You looked like you'd run if I did. You had this wariness about you, like a wild animal ready to bolt. And I realized that chasing you down, forcing a confrontation, it wouldn't help either of us. You weren't ready. Tom absorbed this slowly. She'd been so close. They could have had years instead of days. But she was right. If she'd confronted him then, 10 years ago, he would have run. He hadn't been ready to face his past. When did you stop tracking me? He asked. About 5 years ago. You'd gotten harder to follow. You were moving into more remote areas, staying away from towns. And I was getting older, tired of the chase. She folded the map carefully. That's when I really committed to this place. Stopped looking outward and started preparing inward. Built this hollow into a real home. Collected your things with more purpose. And I waited. Tom picked up another paper from the pile. It was a letter addressed to Sarah from someone named Martha. His heart skipped. My sister. I contacted her about 3 years ago, Sarah said. Told her I was an old friend, that I'd known you before you left. Asked if she'd heard anything. We've been corresponding ever since." Tom opened the letter with trembling fingers. Martha's handwriting was neat, her words warm. "Dear Sarah," it read. "Thank you for your last letter. No, I haven't heard anything about Tom, though I keep hoping. I think about him every day, wonder if he's safe, if he's happy. I've made my peace with the idea that I might never see him again, but it doesn't stop me from hoping. If you do hear anything, please let me know. And thank you for keeping his memory alive. It means more than you know." Tom had to set the letter down. His younger sister, still thinking about him, still hoping. He'd left her when she was just 14. She'd be 54 now, a grown woman with her own life, her own family. "She wants to see you," Sarah said gently. "I haven't told her you're here yet, but when you're ready, I can contact her." "I don't know if I'm ready," Tom admitted. "I don't know what I'd say to her." "How do you apologize for 40 years? "You start by showing up," Sarah said. "The rest will follow." They spent the afternoon in quiet conversation, filling in decades of gaps. Sarah told him about her years in the wilderness, the peace she'd found in solitude, the way the forest had healed wounds that civilization couldn't touch. She spoke of winters alone, summers visited by rangers and the occasional hiker. She'd become a kind of legend in the area, the woman who lived in the tree, the keeper of the old-growth forest. Tom shared his own stories, though they felt thin compared to hers. Ranches where he'd worked, men he'd known briefly, the slow accumulation of skills and scars. He talked about the loneliness, which he'd grown so accustomed to that it felt like an old coat, uncomfortable but familiar. As evening approached, Sarah made dinner, venison stew from her stores, root vegetables she'd put up in the fall, bread she'd baked that morning. The domesticity of it felt strange to Tom, who'd eaten most of his meals alone for decades. But it also felt right in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "Tell me about the accident," Tom said finally, as they sat with coffee after the meal. "Tell me everything." "I need to hear it from you," Sarah nodded, as if she'd been expecting this request. She set down her cup and folded her hands on the table. "We were driving back from the Miller place," she began. "You'd gone to pick up that saddle oak lumber you'd been wanting. It was late afternoon, the road was dry. We were talking about the harvest dance, about what color dress I should wear." She smiled at the memory. "You were teasing me, saying I'd look beautiful in anything." And then she paused, gathering herself. Tom wanted to tell her she didn't have to continue, but he needed to hear it. Needed to understand. Then there was a crack like a gunshot. The wagon lurched to one side. "You tried to control it, I remember that. You were fighting with the reins, trying to steer us away from the ravine. But the whole front axle gave way, and suddenly we were tumbling." Her hand went unconsciously to her side. "I remember hitting the ground, pain, your voice calling my name, and then nothing for a while." "I thought you were dead," Tom whispered. "There was so much blood." "Head wounds bleed badly," Sarah said. "But I woke up 2 days later. My father told me about the axle, how the sheriff had examined it and found the crack. He told me you'd left. I didn't believe it at first. Thought you'd be back once you knew I was all right." She looked at Tom with an expression of old sorrow. "But you didn't come back." "I couldn't face it," Tom said. "Couldn't face you or my parents or anyone. The guilt was—" He struggled for words. "It ate me alive, Sarah. I thought I'd destroyed your life. Destroyed everything. Running seemed like the only option. And now?" Sarah asked quietly. "Now that you know the truth, what do you feel?" Tom considered the question carefully. "Regret," he said finally. "Deep regret for all the time we lost. But also," he paused, surprised by what he was about to say, "relief, after 40 years of carrying that weight. Knowing it wasn't my fault. It doesn't erase the lost time, but it lifts something. Like I can finally breathe properly." Sarah reached across and took his hand. Her fingers were strong despite their age, calloused from years of work. "Then maybe it wasn't all wasted," she said. "Maybe you needed those 40 years to be ready for this moment. To be ready to forgive yourself." They sat in silence as the fire burned low, hands clasped across the table, while outside the forest settled into its deep winter sleep. By the 5th day, a thaw had begun. Water dripped from the high branches, and patches of ground began to show through the snow. Tom and Sarah had settled into a careful rhythm, moving around each other in the small space with surprising ease. It reminded Tom of his early years on his father's ranch, that comfortable silence that comes from working alongside someone you trust. But there was tension too, unspoken but present. They were two people who'd once loved each other deeply, now aged and changed, trying to figure out what they were to each other now. Sometimes Tom would catch Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sometimes their hands would brush and linger a moment too long. That morning, Sarah led Tom to a trunk he hadn't explored yet. This one was larger than the others, made of oak instead of cedar. "I want to show you something," she said quietly. She opened the trunk, and Tom saw white fabric, something carefully folded and preserved. Sarah lifted it out with reverent hands. It was a dress, he realized. A wedding dress, handmade from lace and cotton, yellowed slightly with age, but still beautiful. "I made this the year after the accident," Sarah said, holding it up. The dress was simple but elegant, the kind of thing a young woman would make with hope and care. "I kept thinking you'd come back. That once you learned I'd survived, you'd return and we'd—" She stopped, her voice catching. Tom felt his chest tighten. "Sarah, I know it seems foolish now," she continued. "Keeping a wedding dress for 40 years, waiting for a man who was never coming back. But I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. It was like giving up hope entirely." Tom reached out and touched the fabric, feeling the delicate work that had gone into every stitch. This dress represented everything they could have been. A wedding, a life together, children who might have been, grandchildren they'd never meet. A whole future that had evaporated in one terrible moment of panic and misunderstanding. "It's not foolish," he said. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Sarah carefully folded the dress and returned it to the trunk. When she stood, tears were running down her lined cheeks. Tom pulled her into an embrace, and they stood there holding each other while outside the forest dripped and melted. "I'm so sorry," Tom whispered into her hair. "For all of it. For running, for staying away, for letting fear rule my life." "I know," Sarah said against his chest. "I know you are." They pulled apart eventually, both wiping at their eyes. Sarah laughed a little, a sound that was half sob. "Look at us. Two old fools crying over what might have been. Nothing foolish about it," Tom said. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been growing in his mind for days. "What happens now? After the snow melts?" Sarah met his eyes. "That depends on you, I suppose. You're free to go. I won't stop you. Won't try to make you stay against your will. And if I wanted to stay—" Something shifted in Sarah's expression. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. "Then you'd be welcome. This hollow is big enough for two." "Always has been." Tom nodded slowly, processing what she was offering. "A home, an end to running, a chance to finally stop moving and put down roots." At 68 years old, it was everything he'd denied himself for 40 years. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I've been running so long, I don't know how to stand still." "You don't have to decide right now," Sarah said. "The snow hasn't melted yet. We have time." But Tom felt the urgency of time in a way he never had before. How much time did they have, really? They were both old, with more years behind than ahead. Every day wasted was a day they'd never get back. That afternoon, they worked together to clear snow from around the hollow tree's entrance. It was hard physical labor that left them both breathing heavy, but it felt good to move, to accomplish something tangible. Clover watched from her shelter, occasionally nickering her approval. Later, Sarah showed Tom her garden plots, buried now under snow but marked with stakes. She'd been cultivating vegetables, herbs, even some flowers. In spring and summer, she said, the forest floor around the tree came alive with color and growth. She'd learned what would grow in the shade of the great trees, what needed more sun, what the deer would leave alone. "It's a good life," she told him as they stood looking at the snow-covered plots. "Quiet but good. I've made peace with solitude." But she glanced at him. Company would be nice. The right company. That evening, Tom found himself playing the harmonica Sarah had kept all these years. His fingers remembered the patterns despite the decades, and soon a simple tune filled the hollow tree. Sarah listened with closed eyes, swaying slightly. You used to play that tune for me, she said. Down by the creek, on summer evenings. I remember, Tom said. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Tom set the harmonica aside and moved to where Sarah sat. He took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the solid reality of her presence. Sarah, he began, then stopped, unsure how to say what he was feeling. Yes, I love you, he said simply. I'd loved you then, and I think I've loved you all this time, even when I was trying not to, even when I thought you were dead. Sarah's eyes filled again, but she was smiling. I love you too, Tom, always have, always will. They kissed then, tentatively at first, then with more certainty. It wasn't like the kisses of their youth. Those had been urgent and full of unexplored passion. This kiss was different, slower, deeper, weighted with everything they'd lived through and lost and somehow found again when they pulled apart. Tom felt something inside himself settle, like a piece of machinery that had been grinding for decades, finally clicking into place. I want to stay, he said, if you'll have me. I want to stop running. Sarah's smile was radiant despite her tears. Then stay. Stay and help me tend this forest. Stay and be home. They sat together by the fire, Sarah's head resting on Tom's shoulder, and talked about the future instead of the past. Small plans at first, spring planting, repairs to Clover's shelter, expanding the storage areas. But beneath those practical discussions was something bigger, the possibility of building a life together, however many years they had left. There's something else, Sarah said as the evening grew late. Something I haven't told you yet. Tom tensed slightly, some old instinct warning him of difficult news. I've been in touch with the Park Service, Sarah continued. This land, the hollow tree and the forest around it, I've been working to have it protected, preserved. I want it to stay wild after I'm gone. That's good, Tom said, relaxing slightly. That's important work. I've also been writing, Sarah said, recording the history of this place, the old trees, the ecosystem. Thought maybe it could be a book someday, or at least a record for whoever comes after. She paused. I could use help with that. Someone who knows how to tell a story. Tom thought about his journal from years ago, the observations he'd made about weather and animals and the rhythms of ranch life. He'd forgotten he could do that, could observe and record and make sense of the world through words. I'd like that, he said. I'd like to help. They stayed up late that night, talking about the forest, about conservation, about the legacy they might leave. And for the first time in 40 years, Tom Ransom felt like he had a future worth planning for. Tom woke before dawn on the 7th day, lying in the darkness of the hollow tree. Something felt different. Not wrong exactly, but changed. He'd slept in the cot while Sarah took the small bedroom she'd carved higher in the tree, maintaining a respectful distance despite their renewed closeness. But Tom had been thinking about that distance, had been thinking about a lot of things. Old habits die hard. That's what his father used to say. And Tom's oldest habit, the one that had defined his life for 4 decades, was running. Not physical running anymore. His body was too old for that. But emotional running, the impulse to leave before things got too real, too complicated, too likely to hurt. He lay in the darkness, listening to the drip of melting snow outside, and felt that familiar pull, the urge to slip out before Sarah woke, to saddle Clover and disappear into the forest, to return to the only life he knew, solitary, simple, safe. Tom sat up slowly, his decision crystallizing. He'd leave a note. Thank Sarah for everything, tell her he couldn't stay, that he wasn't built for this kind of life anymore. She'd understand. She'd said he was free to go. He began gathering his few belongings, moving quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. I knew you'd try to run. Tom froze. Sarah's voice came from the stairs leading up, calm but firm. He turned to see her descending, wrapped in a wool shawl, her grey braid hanging over one shoulder. She looked at him without surprise or anger, just a deep sadness that cut Tom more deeply than any accusation could have. How long have you been awake? He asked. All night, Sarah said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. I could feel you thinking about it. The way you went quiet yesterday evening. The way you kept looking at the door. She moved to the fire and began building it up, her movements practiced and efficient. I've watched enough wild animals to recognize when something's about to bolt. Tom set his saddlebag down, shame flooding through him. I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. How to stay. I know, Sarah said. She lit a lamp and turned to face him fully. And I understand, I do. 40 years of running isn't something you can just stop overnight. She paused, her expression shifting to something more serious. But before you go, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you days ago. Something in her tone made Tom's chest tighten. What is it? Sarah moved to the table and sat down, gesturing for Tom to join her. He did, settling into the familiar chair across from her. In the lamplight, he could see how tired she looked, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual. I'm dying, Tom. The words hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable. Tom felt the floor drop out from under him. What? Cancer, Sarah said quietly. They found it about 6 months ago, pancreatic. I went to a doctor in Sacramento, got all the tests done. They offered treatment, chemotherapy, surgery, all of it. But the prognosis wasn't good, even with treatment. 6 months, maybe a year. And I'd spend most of that time sick from the treatments, in and out of hospitals. Tom couldn't breathe. The hollow tree suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. So I declined, Sarah continued. Came back here to the forest. Decided I'd rather spend my last months in the place I love, living on my own terms. She reached across the table and took his hand. I have maybe 3 months left, Tom. 4 if I'm lucky. No. The word came out choked. Tom pulled his hand back, standing abruptly. No, this isn't, you can't. I'm sorry, Sarah said, and she sounded it. I know this isn't fair. Bringing you here, letting you think we had time. Why didn't you tell me? Tom demanded. Why let me think? He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the future he'd been imagining. Years together. A chance to make up for lost time? Because I needed you to come here for the right reasons, Sarah said, standing to face him. Not out of pity or obligation. I needed you to come back because you wanted to understand the truth, to forgive yourself, to finally stop running. She took a step closer. If I'd told you I was dying, you would have come out of guilt or duty, and that wouldn't have freed either of us. Tom felt anger building alongside his grief. So this was all a manipulation? The photographs, the letters, He gestured around the hollow. All of this was just to trick me into coming here. No, Sarah said firmly. This was about giving you the truth. About releasing you from the false guilt you've carried all these years. The fact that I'm dying, that's just an unfortunate reality. But Tom, think about what these past few days have meant. The conversations we've had, the forgiveness we've given each other. That's real. That matters, regardless of how much time I have left. Tom turned away, unable to look at her. His mind was reeling. Sarah was dying. After finding her again, after discovering she'd been alive all along, after beginning to imagine a future, she was dying. There's more, Sarah said behind him. I found you, Tom. Or rather, I guided you here. It wasn't chance. Tom turned back. What? The ranger who mentioned seeing you, I asked him to suggest this direction if he encountered you. To mention the old trails, the remote areas where you'd be likely to go. I put the word out through all my contacts, creating a path that would lead you here. Sarah's expression was both apologetic and resolute. And then I waited for you to follow that path home. So none of this was real, Tom said bitterly. It was all staged. The setup was staged, Sarah corrected. But your choice to come here? That was real. Your reactions to what you found? Real. Everything we've shared these past days? Real. She moved closer, her eyes locked on his. I didn't force you to stay, Tom. I didn't make you open up or talk about the past or consider a future. You chose all of that. Tom felt something cracking inside him. Sarah had orchestrated this reunion, had guided him here knowing she was dying, knowing they'd have only weeks together instead of years. The unfairness of it, the cruel cosmic joke of finally finding what he'd lost, only to have it ripped away again, was almost too much to bear. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why go to all this trouble for a few months? Because I love you, Sarah said simply. Because I've loved you for 40 years, and I wanted to see you one more time. To give you the truth, to set you free from your guilt. And selfishly, her voice wavered, selfishly, I wanted to spend my last months with someone I loved. I didn't want to die alone. Tom felt tears running down his face. He was angry and heartbroken and overwhelmed, but underneath it all was something else. Understanding. If their positions were reversed, if he'd been the one dying, wouldn't he have done the same thing? You should have told me sooner, he said. I know. And I'm sorry. But I was afraid. Afraid you'd run immediately. Afraid you'd see this as another burden of guilt to carry. Sarah wiped at her own eyes. I wanted a few days where we could just be Tom and Sarah again. Before the dying became the focus. Tom moved to the chair and sat heavily. His mind was spinning through the implications. 3 months. Maybe 4. That's all they had. And he'd been about to waste those months by running away again. He looked up at Sarah, this woman who'd waited 40 years for him, who'd built a shrine to their lost love, who'd spent her last months trying to free him from his guilt. What happens now? He asked. Sarah sat down across from him, her expression hopeful despite everything. That's up to you. You can still leave. I meant what I said. You're free to go. I won't hold it against you, she paused. Or you can stay. Stay with me for however long we have. Help me live these last months fully instead of just waiting to die. Tom thought about running. Thought about saddling Clover and riding out, leaving this impossible situation behind. It would be easier, cleaner. No watching Sarah decline, no sitting with her through pain. No final goodbye that would break whatever pieces of his heart remained intact. But he also thought about the wedding dress in the trunk. About 40 years of Sarah waiting and hoping. About the fact that she'd spent her last months trying to give him peace instead of seeking comfort for herself. He thought about his pattern of running and how it had cost him everything that mattered. His family, his home, 4 decades of connection and love. And he realized with sudden clarity that he was tired of running. Tired of letting fear dictate his choices. Tired of being alone. I'll stay, Tom said, his voice steady despite his tears. For however long you have. I'll stay. Sarah's face crumpled with relief. Thank you, she whispered. They sat in the growing dawn light, 2 old people facing an ending they couldn't prevent. But they'd face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The days that followed took on a different quality, both more precious and more fragile than before. Tom and Sarah fell into a careful partnership, each morning a gift neither of them took for granted. Sarah's condition was stable for now, but they both knew it wouldn't last. The cancer was a shadow in the room, unspoken but always present. Tom threw himself into learning everything Sarah could teach him about the hollow tree and the forest around it. She showed him the water collection system she'd rigged, how to maintain the ventilation, which trees in the surrounding area were sick or dying. She taught him about the ecosystem, the old-growth forest's complex web of life, how everything connected to everything else. This place is more than just a home, she told him one morning, as they walked through melting snow to check on a fallen tree. It's a refuge, for animals, for the land itself. Once this forest gets logged, it doesn't come back. Not in any meaningful way. Not in our lifetimes, or our grandchildren's lifetimes. Tom understood what she was really saying. This was her legacy. This was what she wanted to leave behind. Not just the hollow tree, but the protected forest around it. And she was passing that responsibility to him. 2 weeks after the revelation about Sarah's illness, Tom wrote a letter to his sister. He'd put it off, afraid of what he'd say, but Sarah encouraged him. You need to reconcile with your family, she said. Not for them, but for you, so you don't have more regrets to carry. The letter was harder to write than Tom expected. How did you summarize 40 years of absence? How did you apologize for missing decades of someone's life? In the end, he kept it simple. He told Martha he was alive, that he was sorry, and that he'd found Sarah. He gave her the coordinates of the hollow tree and said if she wanted to visit, she'd be welcome. He sent the letter with a forest ranger who passed through, a young man named David, who knew Sarah and brought supplies when the roads were passable. David promised to mail it from the nearest town. Think she'll come? Tom asked Sarah after David left. "She'll come," Sarah said with certainty. Martha's been waiting for this moment her whole adult life. While they waited for a response, Tom and Sarah fell into domestic routines that felt both strange and right to Tom. They cooked together, cleaned together, sat by the fire in the evenings and talked. Sarah taught him card games. Tom carved small figures from wood, birds mostly, and left them around the hollow like small gifts. Sarah had good days and bad days. On good days she was energetic, moving around the hollow with ease, going for short walks in the forest. On bad days she tired easily, pain flickering across her face when she thought Tom wasn't looking. He learned to read her moods, to know when to push her to rest and when to leave her be. One evening, Sarah brought out paper and colored pencils. "I want to make something," she said. "With you?" "A memory quilt." Tom looked at the pencils skeptically. "I can't sew, Sarah." "You can learn," she said with a smile. "Besides, we're just planning it now, drawing what we want each square to represent. We'll sew it together later." So they sat together at the table, designing squares that would tell their story. One square for their first meeting, Sarah drew two young people by a creek. Another for the accident. One for the 40 years apart. One for the hollow tree. One for their reunion. This one, Sarah said, sketching carefully, is for the life we could have had. She drew a simple house, two figures standing in front of it. Smaller figures, children around them. Tom felt the familiar ache of lost possibilities. "Do you regret it? Not having that life?" Sarah considered the question. "I regret the circumstances. The accident, your leaving, the time we lost. But regret the life I did have? No." She looked up at him. "I made something here, Tom. Something meaningful. This forest, this hollow, it's been a good life. Different from what I imagined, but good." "You're a better person than I am," Tom said. "I've spent 40 years regretting everything." "That's because you never forgave yourself," Sarah pointed out. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing. It's about releasing the weight, letting yourself move forward." They worked on the quilt design for several evenings, adding more squares. Tom drew one representing Clover, the companion who'd kept him sane all these years. Sarah drew one for the letters from Tom's mother, the forgiveness offered even in absence. Slowly, their shared history took visual form. 3 weeks after Tom sent his letter, David the ranger returned with news. "Your sister sent a telegram to the ranger station," he told Tom. "She's coming." "Should arrive within the week." Tom felt his stomach drop. After 40 years, he was going to see Martha again. Little Martha, who'd been just a girl when he left. The reality of it was overwhelming. "It's going to be all right," Sarah assured him after David left. "She loves you. That's clear from her letters. Whatever anger she might have felt, it's long gone. How can you be sure?" "Because she's been hoping for this for 40 years, Sarah said. "People don't hold on to hope that long if they're full of anger." Tom spent the next few days in a state of nervous anticipation. He cleaned the hollow obsessively, organized things that didn't need organizing, checked on Clover more than necessary. Sarah watched with amused patience. "You're allowed to be nervous," she told him. "This is a big moment." Martha arrived on a clear spring morning. Tom heard the voices first, David's and a woman's, talking as they approached through the forest. He stood at the entrance to the hollow, his heart hammering, and then she was there, Martha, his little sister, now a woman of 54 with grey-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She stopped when she saw him, her hand going to her mouth. "Tom?" "Hi, Martha." They stood there for a long moment, taking each other in. Then Martha was moving forward, closing the distance between them, and Tom found himself wrapped in a fierce embrace. His sister was crying, and so was he, 40 years of separation collapsing into this one moment. "You're alive," Martha kept saying. "You're alive." "You're really alive." "I'm alive," Tom confirmed, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry, Martha. I'm so sorry I left." "You're here now," Martha said, pulling back to look at him. "That's what matters." Sarah had retreated into the hollow to give them privacy, but now she emerged, and Tom made introductions. Martha and Sarah embraced like old friends, all the years of letters between them creating an instant bond. Martha had brought her son, Jacob, a quiet man in his 20s, who looked at Tom with curiosity rather than judgment. Tom shook his nephew's hand, overwhelmed by the reality of family. This tall young man was blood relation, someone who carried forward the family line Tom had abandoned. They spent 3 days together. Martha told Tom about their parents' deaths, about her own life, her marriage, her children. She showed him photographs of people he'd never met, nieces and nephews, cousins' children, the branches of a family tree he'd cut himself off from. She spoke without bitterness, just a matter-of-fact recounting of what he'd missed. In return, Tom told her about his years of drifting, though he softened some of the harder parts. He talked about Sarah, about finding the hollow tree, about learning the truth of the accident. Martha listened without interrupting, her hand occasionally reaching out to squeeze his, as if reassuring herself he was really there. Sarah and Martha bonded over the quilt project, Martha's sewing skills far superior to Tom's fumbling attempts. They worked together to cut fabric from scraps and materials Martha had brought, beginning to assemble the memory quilt they'd designed. On the second evening, after Jacob had gone to sleep in a tent they'd set up near the hollow, Martha asked the question Tom had been expecting. "Are you coming home? Back to Oregon? You could stay with us. We have plenty of room." Tom glanced at Sarah, who sat quietly by the fire. "This is my home now," he said. "Here with Sarah, for as long as—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Martha followed his gaze, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Months," Sarah said. "A few months, probably." Martha was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then she nodded, acceptance settling over her features. "Then I'm glad Tom found you? Glad you both have this time together?" She looked at Tom. "But after, you'll have family waiting. If you want it." "I want it," Tom said, his voice thick. "After Sarah, I'll need family." The night before Martha left, they gathered around the fire, Tom, Sarah, Martha, and Jacob. Martha pulled something from her bag, a pocket watch on a chain. "This was Dad's," she said, handing it to Tom. "Mom wanted you to have it. She kept it all these years, hoping she could give it to you herself. When she died, she left instructions that if you ever came back, it should go to you." Tom opened the watch. Inside the cover was an inscription, "Time forgives all who come home." His father's handwriting. "He never stopped believing you'd return," Martha said. Neither of them did. Tom closed the watch carefully, the weight of his parents' faith in him almost too much to bear. But it was a good weight, a reminder that he'd been loved even in his absence. When Martha and Jacob left the next morning, it was with promises to return, to stay connected, to not let another 40 years pass in silence. Tom watched them disappear into the forest, then turned back to the hollow tree where Sarah waited. He had family again. He had love. And he had time, not much, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to heal. Enough to finally stop running and be home. Spring came fully to the forest, bringing new green to the undergrowth and wildflowers to the clearings. Tom had been at the hollow tree for nearly 3 months now, and the changes in Sarah were becoming more pronounced. She tired more easily, needed help with tasks that had once been simple, spent more time resting than moving. But there were still good moments. Mornings when she woke without pain, and they could sit outside, watching the forest come alive. Afternoons when she had enough energy to work on the memory quilt, which was taking shape square by square. Evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, just being present with each other. The quilt had become their joint project, a physical manifestation of their shared history. Tom had learned to sew, his large, calloused hands making surprisingly neat stitches. Sarah guided him, correcting his mistakes with gentle patience. Each square told a story. Their first meeting by the creek, represented by blue fabric and careful embroidery. The accident, shown in darker colors with a broken wheel. Tom's long wandering, depicted by a winding path across brown fabric. The hollow tree, created from green and gold scraps, with a tiny door sewn from darker thread. "This one," Sarah said one morning, working on a new square. "This should be us now, old but together." She used grey fabric for their hair, choosing material carefully from the scraps Martha had brought and supplies Sarah had collected over the years. Two figures side by side, holding hands. Behind them, the massive trunk of the redwood tree. "It's beautiful," Tom said, watching her work. Her hands shook slightly now, making the stitching harder, but she persevered. "It tells the truth," Sarah replied. "That's all I wanted. A record of what was real between us." As April turned toward May, Sarah's condition worsened. The pain came more frequently, and Tom learned to administer the medications the doctor had prescribed before Sarah stopped seeking medical care. He was gentle with her, helping her to the bathroom, bringing her water, reading to her when she couldn't sleep. One night, Sarah asked him to carry her outside. It was a clear evening, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue sky. Tom wrapped her in blankets and lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she'd become. He'd known intellectually that she was losing weight, but feeling it was different. She seemed fragile in his arms, breakable. He carried her out to the base of the great redwood and settled beside her on a fallen log, keeping her wrapped close against the evening chill. Clover wandered over, now grazing freely near the hollow, and nuzzled Sarah gently. The old mare seemed to understand, in the way animals sometimes do, that something was ending. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, stroking Clover's nose with weak fingers, "for taking care of him all these years." Tom felt tears threaten but held them back. Sarah didn't need his grief right now. She needed his presence, his strength, his love. "Tell me about the tree," Sarah said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Describe it like you did that first night." Tom looked up at the massive redwood, its trunk disappearing into darkness above, branches reaching toward stars. "It's ancient," he said, his voice low and steady. "Maybe 1,000 years old, maybe more. It was here before any of us, before our parents, before their parents, going back generations. It'll be here after we're gone, standing watch over this forest." "What else?" Sarah asked, her eyes closed. "It's strong," Tom continued. "Roots going deep into the earth, trunk thick enough to hold a home inside it. It's survived fires, storms, droughts. It's seen countless springs and winters. And it's beautiful. The way the bark furrows and twists, the way light filters down through the branches, the way it shelters everything beneath it. Like you," Sarah murmured. "Strong and beautiful and sheltering." "I'm none of those things," Tom said. "You are now," Sarah insisted. "You found your way here. You stayed. You faced everything you'd been running from. That takes strength, Tom." They sat in silence, listening to the forest's evening sounds, birds settling for the night, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through the high branches. Tom held Sarah close, feeling each breath she took, each heartbeat against his side. "I'm not afraid," Sarah said quietly, "of what's coming. I want you to know that. How can you not be afraid?" Tom asked. "Because I'm complete," Sarah said. "I found you again, gave you the truth. We had this time together. That's more than I dared hope for 6 months ago." She reached up and touched his face. "Promise me you'll stay, that you'll be the keeper of this place after I'm gone." "I promise," Tom said, his voice breaking. "I'll stay. I'll protect it, and promise you'll live," Sarah said, her words growing softer. "Not just exist, but live. Connect with your family. Let people in. Don't go back to running. I promise," Tom repeated, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Sarah smiled, content. Tom carried her back inside as true darkness fell, settling her in bed with gentle care. He sat beside her, holding her hand, and they talked in whispers about small things. The pattern of light through leaves, the taste of coffee, the feeling of sun on skin, until Sarah's words grew slurred with exhaustion and medication. "Love you," she managed to say, her eyes already closing. "Love you too," Tom replied. "Always have. Always will." He watched her sleep, this woman who'd saved him in more ways than he could count, and prepared himself for what he knew was coming. Dawn broke with unusual beauty, light streaming through the forest in golden shafts that seemed almost deliberate. Tom had dozed fitfully in the chair beside Sarah's bed, jerking awake at every change in her breathing. Now, as morning filled the hollow with warm light, Sarah's eyes opened. She looked clearer than she had in days, her gaze focused and present in a way Tom recognized as both gift and warning. This was what people called a rally, a brief return of clarity before the end. "Tom," she said, her voice weak but steady. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand. Sarah smiled, a real smile that reminded him of the girl she'd been. "Beautiful morning." "It is," Tom agreed, though his chest was tight with approaching grief. Sarah's free hand moved to the table beside her bed, fumbling with a drawer. Tom helped her, following her gesture, until his fingers found an envelope. His name was written on it in Sarah's careful script, though the handwriting was shakier than usual. "For after," Sarah said. "I wrote it a few weeks ago. When I could still—" She paused to catch her breath. When the words came easier, "Read it after." "Not now." Tom set the letter aside with trembling hands. "Sarah, no," she said gently. "No sadness yet. We have this moment. Let's not waste it." Tom nodded, swallowing hard. He adjusted her pillows, helping her sit up slightly so she could see out through the open door of the hollow. "Where morning light painted the forest in shades of green and gold, you were my great adventure," Sarah said, each word deliberate. "People think adventure is about traveling or seeing exotic places. But you, loving you, searching for you, waiting for you, that was my greatest journey. No regrets, Tom, not one. You were mine too," Tom managed. "My truest love. The only thing I ever did right was loving you. Even when I thought you were gone, even when I was running, part of me always belonged to you." "I know," Sarah said. "I felt it. Somehow, across all those miles and years, I felt it." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for staying. Thank you for these months. Thank you for waiting," Tom replied. "For giving me the truth. For saving me from myself." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, just being together. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice growing fainter. "The regret," she said. "Let it go now. We had what we had. That's enough." "More than enough? I'll try," Tom promised. "The tree," Sarah said. "Tell me about it one more time." Tom looked out at the massive redwood, morning light catching its ancient bark. "It stands like a monument," he said softly. "Tall and strong and permanent. Its roots go deeper than we can imagine, holding it steady through every storm. Its branches reach up to touch the sky, and its trunk is wide enough to hold a whole world inside. A refuge, a home, a legacy," Sarah added. "A legacy," Tom agreed. Sarah's eyes began to close, a peaceful expression settling over her features. "Good," she whispered. "That's good." Tom felt the change before he understood it. Her breathing had grown shallow, each breath a little further apart than the last. He held her hand tighter, leaning close so she could feel his presence. "I love you," he said. "I love you, Sarah. Thank you." "Thank you for everything." Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite hear, but he knew what they were. "I love you too." And then, so quietly he almost missed it, her breathing stopped. Tom sat with her for a long time. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, light shifting through the hollow. He held her hand, which grew gradually cooler, and let himself feel everything, the grief, the loss, the gratitude, the love. He cried without shame, great silent tears that fell onto their clasped hands. When he finally felt ready, he gently released her hand and picked up the letter. His fingers shook as he broke the seal. "My dearest Tom," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't hold on longer, couldn't give us more time. But I want you to know that what we had was perfect, complete, everything I hoped for. Now I need you to do something for me. Live, really live. Don't isolate yourself out here. Yes, be the keeper of this forest, protect it, love it, tend it. But don't hide from the world. Martha needs her brother. Your family needs you. Let them in. Let them love you. And Tom, love isn't betrayal. If you find companionship, friendship, even romance again someday, that doesn't diminish what we had. It honors it. Because I taught you how to stay, how to open your heart, how to be home. Use those lessons. I'm not afraid of what comes next. I'm only grateful for what came before. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Be well, my love. Be happy, and remember, the tree stands strong. So can you. Forever yours, Sarah. Tom read the letter 3 times, each word settling into his heart. Then he carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. He stood, his body stiff from sitting so long, and began the practical tasks that needed doing. He prepared Sarah's body with gentle hands, washing her face, combing her hair, dressing her in her favorite wool dress. He wrapped her in the quilt they'd made together, each square a memory, and carried her outside. The grave he dug was beside the great redwood, in a spot where morning sun reached through the canopy. It took him most of the day, his old body protesting every shovelful of earth, but he worked steadily. This was his final act of love, and he would do it properly. He buried her as the sun began to set, saying words that came from his heart rather than any book. He marked the spot with a simple wooden cross he'd carved, her name and dates etched deep into the wood. When it was done, Tom stood alone in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of loss pressing down on him. But beneath the grief was something else, gratitude. Sarah had given him back himself, had freed him from 40 years of false guilt and self-imposed isolation, had shown him how to love, how to stay, how to be home. He placed his hand on the rough bark of the redwood tree and made a silent promise. He would stay. He would protect this place. He would live, not just exist. He would honor Sarah's memory by being the man she'd believed he could be. The forest settled into its evening rhythms around him, and Tom Ransom stood between the tree and the fresh grave. No longer running, finally home. Weeks turned into months, and Tom remained at the hollow tree. There were moments when the old urge to run would surface, particularly on difficult days when Sarah's absence felt most acute. But he'd made a promise, both to Sarah and to himself, and Tom Ransom had learned that promises mattered more than comfort. The forest changed with the seasons, and Tom changed with it. He was no longer the man who'd stumbled upon the hollow tree that winter night, lost, guilt-ridden, running from everything. He was becoming someone new, or perhaps someone he'd always been meant to be. Martha visited regularly, sometimes with her son Jacob, sometimes with other family members Tom was slowly getting to know. There were grandnieces and grandnephews, children who looked at him with curiosity and called him Uncle Tom. The first time a little girl had climbed into his lap and asked him to tell her a story about the forest, Tom had felt something break open inside his chest. Not pain this time, but possibility. He told her about the redwood trees, how they'd been standing for thousands of years, how they were some of the oldest living things on earth. Her eyes had gone wide with wonder, and Tom understood then what Sarah had known, that he had something to offer, stories and knowledge and presence. If he'd just stopped running long enough to share it, Tom became the keeper of the land, as Sarah had been. He maintained the trails she'd established, marked dangerous areas, kept watch over the old growth forest. When hikers or rangers passed through, he'd welcome them cautiously, sharing what he knew about the ecosystem, pointing out rare plants or animal tracks. The hollow tree became known in the area as Sarah's sanctuary, and Tom was its guardian. Inside the hollow, Tom created a memorial. He arranged Sarah's artifacts carefully, the photographs on their shelf, the letters from his mother in a place of honor, the memory quilt spread across the wall. Visitors who earned his trust were allowed to see it, to hear the story of the woman who'd lived in a tree and waited 40 years for the man she loved. On the first anniversary of Sarah's death, Tom did something he'd been planning for months. He'd obtained a redwood sapling from the Park Service, a tiny thing no more than 2 feet tall. He planted it at the head of Sarah's grave with careful hands, mixing good soil with the forest earth, watering it thoroughly. "It'll take 1,000 years to grow as tall as the mother tree," Tom told Sarah's grave. "But you taught me that some things are worth the wait. This tree will be here long after I'm gone, after everyone who knew us is gone. And maybe somehow that matters." He visited the grave every day, speaking to Sarah as if she could hear him. He told her about Martha's visits, about the family he was slowly learning to be part of. He told her about changes in the forest. A new fox den he'd discovered, an eagle's nest in a tall pine. The way the wildflowers had bloomed that spring, in colors more vivid than any he'd seen before. Clover aged alongside him, her muzzle going white, her steps slowing to match his own. They were two old souls, finishing their journey together, and Tom was grateful for her steady presence. She grazed near the hollow, following him on his daily rounds through the forest, content in their simple routine. One evening in late summer, Tom sat on the fallen log outside the hollow tree, the same spot where he'd held Sarah under the stars. He pulled out the harmonica she'd kept all those years, the one he'd carved with young hands and hopeful heart. His fingers found the familiar patterns, and a simple melody drifted through the evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Light filtered down through the massive redwoods, turning everything golden. Tom played and watched and felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, because Sarah's absence was a constant ache, but peace, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be. He thought about his journey, all those wasted years, all that running, all that guilt carried like stones in his pockets. But had they truly been wasted? Every job he'd worked had taught him something. Every town he'd passed through had shaped him. Every lonely night had prepared him for this moment, had made him ready to finally stop, to finally be home. His life hadn't been what he'd planned, or what others might have chosen. But it had led him here, to this hollow tree, to Sarah, to truth and forgiveness and love. Every step of his wandering had been a step toward coming home. He understood that now. Tom no longer feared the end of his road. Death would come eventually, as it came for everyone, but he'd made his peace with it. He'd reconciled with his past, found love again, reconnected with family. He'd built something meaningful here in this forest, continuing Sarah's work, protecting this ancient place. When his time came, he'd be buried beside Sarah, beneath the growing redwood sapling, and someone else would take up the work of keeping this sanctuary. As darkness fell, Tom returned to the hollow tree. He built up the fire, made simple dinner, sat at the table where he and Sarah had shared so many meals and conversations. The memory quilt hung on the wall, each square a testament to a love that had survived separation, time, and death itself. The door to the hollow tree stood open, as Tom always left it, a welcoming light for any wanderer who might need shelter, any soul seeking refuge from their own storms. He'd become what Sarah had been, a keeper not just of the forest, but of truth and compassion and sanctuary. Tom Ransom had finally stopped running. He'd found his way home, and in doing so had discovered that home wasn't a place he'd lost 40 years ago. It was something he'd built day by day, choice by choice, in a hollow tree in the wilderness, with love and patience and the courage to finally stay. Outside, the great redwood stood sentinel in the darkness, ancient and strong and permanent. And inside its hollow heart, an old cowboy sat by the fire, surrounded by memories and peace, his wandering finally over.